The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus as Charles adjusted his worn leather messenger bag and checked his phone for the third time. He was running late for his literature class, something that rarely happened to someone as methodical as him. His routine was sacred. Wake at 6, coffee at 6:15, review notes at 6:30, and arrive at campus by 7:45. Today, however, his alarm had failed him, and the disruption left him feeling oddly unsettled. Charles had always been the type of person who found comfort in predictability. At 22, he had already mapped out the next decade of his life with precision that would make a military strategist proud. Graduate school, teaching assistant position, doctorate, professor. Each step carefully calculated and planned. His friends often joked that he lived his life like a chess game, always thinking several moves ahead. The university corridors buzzed with the familiar chaos of morning rush. Students clutched coffee cups like lifelines, their conversations a mixture of weekend stories and exam anxieties. Charles navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, his tall frame allowing him to see over most heads as he made his way to the English building. Professor Morrison's Victorian literature class was already in session when Charles slipped through the door. He offered a quiet apology and settled into his usual seat in the third row, close enough to show engagement, far enough to avoid being called upon unexpectedly. The classroom held that particular scent of old books and fresh coffee that he had grown to associate with academic comfort. Today we're examining the concept of transformative moments in Dickens, Professor Morrison was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years discussing the same topics with endless enthusiasm. Those pivotal instances when characters' lives shift dramatically, often through seemingly small actions or encounters. Charles pulled out his notebook, the same composition book he had used since freshman year. His handwriting was neat, almost architectural in its precision. He had a system for note-taking that involved different colors for quotes, analysis, and personal observations. Green for quotes, blue for analysis, black for facts. It was a method that had served him well throughout his academic career. The discussion moved toward Great Expectations and Pip's encounter with Miss Havisham. Charles found himself genuinely interested in the conversation, though he rarely spoke up unless directly asked. He preferred to absorb information, process it thoroughly, and form complete thoughts before contributing to discussions. Can anyone think of a moment in their own lives that parallels this kind of instant transformation? Professor Morrison asked, scanning the room with expectant eyes. Several hands shot up. Charles remained still, his pen hovering over his notebook. He could think of moments, his parents' divorce when he was 15, his decision to major in English despite pressure to pursue business, his grandmother's death last spring. But none felt quite right for classroom discussion. They were too personal, too unprocessed. A student in the front row talked about moving to a new city. Another shared about discovering a passion for photography. Charles listened, taking notes not on their words but on the patterns he observed. How people seemed to identify transformation only in retrospect. How they needed distance to understand the significance of certain moments. The class period flew by faster than usual. As students began packing their books, Professor Morrison called out the assignment for next week. I want you to write a 1,000-word essay on a transformative moment from literature. But here's the twist. I want you to imagine what led up to that moment. The ordinary day, the mundane decisions, the small details that made the transformation possible. Charles jotted down the assignment details, already beginning to formulate ideas. He enjoyed assignments that required deep analysis, the kind that let him explore the scaffolding beneath dramatic moments. As he gathered his materials, he noticed he had unconsciously written, "What makes a moment?" in the margin of his notes. The hallway outside the classroom was less crowded now, the initial rush having subsided. Charles walked toward the student union, planning to grab lunch and find a quiet spot to start outlining his essay. The Union Building was a sprawling complex that served as the social heart of campus, filled with study nooks, food courts, and meeting spaces. He ordered his usual turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, and found a table by the large windows overlooking the quad. The autumn light filtered through glass, creating patterns on his open notebook. Charles had always been someone who worked better in public spaces than in solitude. The ambient noise of conversations, footsteps, and clinking dishes provided a backdrop that helped him focus. As he began sketching ideas for his essay, Charles became aware of a conversation at the table behind him. Two students were discussing their plans for winter break, and their excitement was infectious. One was describing a family tradition of making Christmas cookies that dated back 3 generations. The other talked about a ski trip that had been postponed for 2 years due to various complications. Charles found himself thinking about his own winter break plans, which were characteristically modest. He would return home to his parents' house in suburban Connecticut, where he would spend time reading, catching up on correspondence, and preparing for spring semester. His parents had always respected his need for quiet time, perhaps because they recognized his intense focus on academics. His phone buzzed with a text from his roommate, David, asking if he wanted to grab dinner later. Charles typed back a quick yes, grateful for David's easy friendship. They had been randomly assigned as roommates freshman year and had discovered an oddly compatible dynamic. David was social and spontaneous. Charles was thoughtful and planned. Their differences seemed to balance rather than clash. Returning to his essay outline, Charles decided to focus on the moment in Jane Eyre when Jane chooses to leave Thornfield. He wanted to explore the hours leading up to that decision, the internal conversation she must have had with herself, the way ordinary morning activities might have felt different when weighted with such a momentous choice. He wrote steadily for an hour, losing himself in the familiar pleasure of academic analysis. This was where Charles felt most confident, in the realm of ideas, textual interpretation, and careful argumentation. His professors had often praised his writing for its clarity and depth, though some had encouraged him to take more intellectual risks. The Union gradually filled with the afternoon crowd. Charles looked up from his notebook to observe the social dynamics around him. Students moved in clusters, their body language revealing relationships and hierarchies that would be invisible to a casual observer. There were the theater students, animated and dramatic in their gestures. The business majors, polished and purposeful. The arts students, creative chaos visible in their clothing and accessories. Charles had never felt fully part of any particular group. He moved between different social circles depending on context, study groups for academic work, his dorm floor for casual socializing, the literary magazine staff for creative pursuits. It was a comfortable arrangement that allowed him to maintain relationships without the pressure of belonging completely to any single identity. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email from his academic advisor about spring course registration. The process always made Charles slightly anxious, not because of the logistics, but because it forced him to confront the forward motion of time. Each semester brought him closer to graduation and the necessity of making real-world decisions about his future. He closed his notebook and gathered his materials, deciding to head to the library to research background information for his essay. The campus library was his favorite building. 5 floors of quiet study spaces, rare book collections, and the particular silence that comes from thousands of people thinking simultaneously. Charles found a spot on the 3rd floor, in a section devoted to 19th-century British literature. The stacks were quiet, filled with the kind of focused energy he found most conducive to deep work. He pulled several books on Victorian social history, wanting to understand the context that shaped Dickens's view of transformative moments. As he read about the social mobility of the Victorian era, Charles found himself thinking about his own relationship to change. He had always been someone who preferred gradual evolution to sudden transformation. His life had been marked by steady progress rather than dramatic shifts, good grades leading to better opportunities, careful choices building toward clear goals. The afternoon light began to fade outside the library windows. Charles realized he had been reading for several hours, absorbed in research that was probably more thorough than the assignment required. It was a habit of his, diving deeper into topics than strictly necessary, following intellectual curiosity down rabbit holes of information. He checked his phone and saw that David had texted again about dinner plans. They had agreed to meet at 6, which gave Charles just enough time to walk back to his dorm and change out of his morning clothes. The routine of ending his academic day and transitioning to social time was one he had developed carefully over his years at university. The walk across campus in early evening was one of Charles's favorite parts of each day. The light had a particular quality that made familiar buildings look different, more romantic somehow. Students moved more slowly, having shed the urgency of daytime schedules. Conversations were quieter, more intimate. His dorm room was exactly as he had left it that morning. Bed made, desk organized, books arranged by subject and author. Charles appreciated the order, the way everything had its place and purpose. He changed into jeans and a sweater, casual clothes that still maintained the neat appearance that had become his unconscious uniform. David was waiting in the common room when Charles came downstairs, chatting with several other students from their floor. The conversation was about weekend plans, specifically a party that someone was throwing off campus. Charles listened without committing to attendance, as was his usual approach to social invitations. They walked to a restaurant near campus that served decent food at student-friendly prices. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Charles found himself more observant than usual, noticing details that normally escaped his attention. The way streetlights created pools of warmth, the sound of laughter from apartment windows, the comfortable rhythm of walking with a friend. Over dinner, David talked about his plans for winter break, which involved visiting 3 different cities and staying with various friends. His life seemed to Charles like a series of adventures, each more spontaneous than the last. Charles enjoyed hearing about David's experiences, living vicariously through his roommate's social energy, while remaining comfortably in his own quieter space. "What about you?" David asked. "Any exciting plans for break?" Charles described his intention to read, write, and prepare for spring semester. David didn't mock his modest plans, which Charles appreciated. Their friendship worked partly because neither felt the need to change the other's fundamental approach to life. As they walked back to the dorm after dinner, Charles felt the satisfaction that came from a day well lived according to his own standards. He had attended class, made progress on an assignment, conducted thorough research, and maintained social connections. It was the kind of balanced day that formed the foundation of his carefully constructed life. Back in his room, Charles settled at his desk to review the notes he had taken throughout the day. He liked to end each evening by consolidating information, making connections between different ideas, and preparing his mind for the next day's activities. It was a ritual that helped him feel prepared and in control. As he wrote, Charles found himself returning to Professor Morrison's question about transformative moments. He wondered if his life had been shaped by such moments, or if his changes had been so gradual as to be almost imperceptible. The thought didn't trouble him. He had always believed that steady progress was more reliable than dramatic change. His notebook lay open to the page where he had written, "What makes a moment?" The question seemed more complex now, after a day of thinking about it. Charles suspected that transformation might be less about the moments themselves and more about a person's readiness to recognize and act upon them. He closed his notebook and prepared for bed, following his established routine with the same methodical attention he brought to all aspects of his life. Tomorrow would bring another day of classes, research, and careful progress toward his goals. It was a prospect that filled him with quiet satisfaction. Charles fell asleep easily, as he usually did after days that followed his preferred patterns. He could not have imagined that within weeks, his understanding of transformative moments would shift dramatically, or that his carefully ordered life was about to encounter the kind of disruption that makes all previous certainties seem fragile and provisional. The last conscious thought he had was about his essay assignment, and whether he truly understood what Professor Morrison meant by moments that change everything. Soon enough, he would discover that such moments rarely announce themselves in advance, and that the most significant transformations often begin with gestures so small they seem meaningless until viewed from the other side of change. Kate Williams had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Small details fascinated her. The way shadows fell differently on Tuesday mornings than Thursday afternoons, how people's voices changed when they were nervous, the particular quality of silence that preceded important conversations. At 21, she possessed an awareness of her surroundings that bordered on hypervigilance, a trait that had served her well in some situations and poorly in others. The campus coffee shop where she worked part-time was her observatory for human behavior. Between steaming milk and grinding beans, Kate watched the social dynamics of university life unfold with the dedication of an anthropologist. She had mental files on regular customers, their usual orders, their study habits, their relationship dramas played out in whispered conversations over lattes. Wednesday morning brought the usual rush of caffeine-dependent students and faculty. Kate moved efficiently behind the counter, her practiced hands working while her mind cataloged observations. Professor Morrison ordered her double-shot cours d'eau and mentioned grading papers on transformative moments in literature. The theater student with the purple hair asked for extra foam and worried aloud about auditions. The business major who always wore suits despite being undergraduate requested his usual black coffee and checked his phone obsessively. Kate enjoyed the rhythm of busy mornings. Her movements behind the espresso machine had become almost meditative after 2 years of practice. She found satisfaction in crafting drinks exactly to customer preferences, in creating small moments of comfort for people navigating their daily stress. The job paid enough to cover her textbooks and contributed to her sense of independence, both important considerations for someone putting herself through college. Her own academic schedule was lighter on Wednesdays, with just 2 classes in the afternoon. Kate was majoring in psychology with a minor in creative writing, a combination that reflected her dual interests in understanding human behavior and expressing her observations through language. Her professors often commented on her unusual ability to notice patterns in social interaction that escaped other students. The morning rush began to subside around 10 o'clock, leaving Kate with time to prepare for the lunch crowd and catch up on homework. She pulled out a notebook filled with observations and sketches, her personal record of interesting moments she had witnessed. Today she wanted to work on an assignment for her social psychology class about nonverbal communication in public spaces. Kate had chosen the coffee shop as her research site, partly for convenience, but mainly because it provided such rich material. She had identified several patterns in how people used space, personal distance, and gesture to communicate status and comfort levels. The research was genuinely interesting to her, not just academic busy work. A familiar face caught her attention as the door opened. Charles, the quiet English major who came in 3 times a week, always ordering the same medium coffee with 1 sugar. Kate had been observing him for months, intrigued by his consistent routines and the careful way he moved through social situations. He seemed like someone who thought deeply about everything but rarely shared those thoughts spontaneously. She had tried several times to engage him in conversation beyond the transactional exchange of coffee ordering. He was polite, but seemed surprised when she asked questions about his classes or weekend plans. Kate got the impression that he wasn't used to casual social interaction, though she couldn't tell if this was due to shyness or preference for solitude. "Medium coffee, 1 sugar," she said as he approached the counter, smiling in a way that she hoped seemed friendly but not overly forward. "Thank you," Charles replied, pulling exact change from his wallet. He always had exact change, another detail Kate had noticed and filed away. "How's your morning going?" she asked while preparing his drink, trying to extend the interaction naturally. Charles seemed to consider the question more carefully than its simplicity warranted. "Good, thank you. Yours? Busy but enjoyable. I like the energy of morning rush," Kate said, handing him the coffee. "Are you working on anything interesting for classes?" Again, that slight pause, as if he was translating her casual question into something more formal. An essay on transformative moments in Victorian literature. Kate's interest was genuinely piqued. "That sounds fascinating. What kind of transformative moments?" Charles looked surprised that she had asked a follow-up question. "Pivotal instances when characters' lives change direction. Professor Morrison wants us to examine what leads up to those moments. Like the calm before the storm?" Kate suggested. "The ordinary moments that become significant in retrospect." "Exactly." Charles's response came more quickly this time, and Kate caught a glimpse of the engaged thinker behind his careful reserve. "I'm trying to understand what makes certain moments ready for transformation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other customers, and Charles stepped aside with his coffee. Kate served the next few people while thinking about his question. What had made certain moments ready for transformation? She had always been someone who paid attention to the build-up to significant events, the small tensions and preparations that preceded larger changes. During her lunch break, Kate sat in the corner booth with her psychology textbook and notebook, continuing her research on nonverbal communication. She found herself thinking about Charles's question regarding transformative moments. From her observations of coffee shop social dynamics, she had noticed that the most interesting interactions often happened when people's normal patterns were disrupted somehow. Take the graduate student who usually studied alone but today was sharing a table with someone from her research group. Their body language suggested this was a first-time collaboration, with careful positioning and formal gestures gradually relaxing into more natural interaction. Or the couple who came in arguing, but left laughing. Their reconciliation visible in the progression from rigid postures to casual touching. Kate wrote in her notebook, "Transformation requires disruption of normal patterns. People seem most open to change when their usual routines are challenged or interrupted." She wondered if this applied to Charles, whose life seemed built around consistent routines and careful planning. Her afternoon classes passed quickly. In social psychology, they discussed research on how environmental factors influence behavior. In creative writing, they workshopped short stories and Kate offered feedback that her professor said showed exceptional insight into character motivation. She enjoyed both classes, but found herself thinking repeatedly about Charles's research question. After classes, Kate returned to the coffee shop for her evening shift. The afternoon crowd was different from the morning rush. Fewer faculty members, more students settling in for long study sessions. The lighting changed as daylight faded, creating a cozier atmosphere that seemed to encourage longer conversations and more intimate interactions. Charles appeared again around 5 o'clock, which surprised Kate since he wasn't usually an afternoon customer. He looked slightly uncertain as he approached the counter, breaking from his normal confident routine. "Medium coffee, 1 sugar?" Kate asked, though his expression suggested something different. "Actually, could I try something else? Maybe something with milk?" Charles seemed almost embarrassed by the deviation from his usual order. Kate hid her surprise at this minor rebellion against his routine. "Of course. Do you like sweet drinks or something more coffee-forward?" "I'm not sure. What would you recommend?" The question felt significant in a way that went beyond coffee preferences. Kate sensed that Charles was trying to step outside his comfort zone, even in this small way. "What's your mood today? Something comforting or energizing?" Charles considered this question with the same seriousness he brought to academic discussions. "Comforting, I think. Try a cappuccino with vanilla. It's still coffee-focused, but warmer and a little sweet." Kate began preparing the drink, taking extra care with the milk foam. "Trying something new for your essay research?" "Not exactly." Charles watched her work with close attention. "I've been thinking about your question earlier, about ordinary moments becoming significant. I wondered if maybe I should try experiencing some different ordinary moments." Kate felt pleased that their earlier conversation had continued in his thoughts. "That's actually brilliant research methodology. How can you write about transformation if you've never stepped outside your own patterns?" As she handed him the cappuccino, their fingers briefly touched. A moment so quick it might have been accidental except for the way both of them paused slightly. Kate felt a small electric awareness that she couldn't immediately categorize. "Thank you," Charles said, and Kate noticed he didn't step away from the counter immediately as he usually did. "Let me know what you think of the drink," she said, though what she meant was something more like, "Let me know how your experiment in change goes." Charles took a sip, his expression thoughtful. "It's different than I expected. More complex. Coffee or change in general?" Kate asked, surprising herself with her directness. Charles smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Both, I think." He found a table near the window instead of his usual spot by the bookshelves, another small deviation from routine that Kate noticed and filed away. She watched him pull out his notebook and begin writing, occasionally looking up to observe the coffee shop dynamics around him. The evening shift moved more slowly than morning rush, giving Kate time to think and observe. She found herself glancing toward Charles's table more frequently than she usually monitored individual customers. There was something compelling about watching someone consciously try to change their patterns, even in small ways. Around 6:30, a group of students at a nearby table began discussing their winter break plans. Their conversation was animated and loud enough to carry throughout the coffee shop. Kate noticed Charles look up from his writing to listen, his expression curious rather than annoyed by the interruption. One student was describing a family reunion in California. Another talked about an internship in Boston. A third mentioned plans to travel through Europe with friends, funding the trip through careful savings and budget planning. Their excitement was infectious, filling the coffee shop with energy that seemed to affect other customers as well. Kate saw Charles close his notebook and approach the counter again, his empty cappuccino cup in hand. "How was it?" she asked, though she was asking about more than just the coffee. "Interesting. I think I understand better what you meant about disruption and transformation." Charles set down his cup. "Those students talking about travel plans, they're describing experiences that will probably change them, but they don't realize it yet. They think they're just planning trips." Kate felt a thrill of intellectual connection. Exactly. They're preparing for transformation without knowing it. The planning itself is part of the process. "It makes me wonder what I might be unconsciously preparing for," Charles said, and Kate heard something vulnerable in his admission. Maybe the preparation is in trying new things, like cappuccinos instead of black coffee. She gestured toward his empty cup with a smile. "Maybe." Charles seemed to consider this possibility seriously. "Could I try something else tomorrow? Another recommendation?" "Absolutely. I'll think of something good." Kate felt pleased by the prospect of continuing this small experiment. Charles gathered his materials and headed toward the door, then turned back. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation. Both were helpful." After he left, Kate found herself thinking about their interactions throughout the day. There had been something different about Charles this evening, a willingness to engage that went beyond his usual polite reserve. She wondered if his essay research was genuinely affecting his behavior, or if some other factor was making him more open to new experiences. The coffee shop emptied gradually as evening deepened into night. Kate cleaned equipment and prepared for closing, her mind still processing the day's observations. She had always been interested in the moments when people stepped outside their established patterns, but witnessing Charles's deliberate experiment in change had been particularly fascinating. In her notebook, she wrote, "Sometimes transformation begins with conscious choice to disrupt routine. Small changes in behavior can create openings for larger shifts in perspective." Question: how much control do people have over their own transformative moments? As she locked up the coffee shop and walked across campus toward her dorm, Kate found herself looking forward to tomorrow's shift with unusual anticipation. She wanted to see if Charles would continue his experiment in new experiences, and she was curious about what coffee recommendation would best support his exploration. The campus was quiet in the evening, with most students either in their rooms studying or out socializing. Kate enjoyed walking alone at night, feeling connected to the physical space of the university in a way that daylight hours didn't allow. The buildings looked different in darkness, more mysterious and full of possibility. Back in her room, Kate opened her creative writing notebook and began sketching ideas for a short story about chance encounters and small moments that reshape people's understanding of themselves. She had always been drawn to fiction that explored the psychology of change, the internal landscape of characters navigating transitions. Her roommate was at the library, giving Kate the solitude she preferred for creative work. She wrote steadily for an hour, developing a story about a coffee shop worker who becomes fascinated by a regular customer's attempts to break out of his routine. The writing flowed easily, probably because she was drawing from her own recent observations and experiences. As she prepared for bed, Kate found herself thinking about Charles's question regarding what makes certain moments ready for transformation. From her perspective as someone who had been paying attention to such things for years, she suspected that readiness had something to do with accumulated awareness, a building consciousness of one's own patterns and limitations that eventually reached a tipping point. She fell asleep wondering what tomorrow would bring, whether Charles would indeed return for another coffee experiment, and what other small disruptions might be rippling beneath the surface of ordinary campus life. Kate had always believed that the most interesting changes began with nearly invisible shifts in attention and intention, and she sensed that something like that was beginning to happen. The last thing she thought before sleep was that she might be part of someone else's transformative moment, just as Charles was becoming part of hers. It was a prospect that filled her with equal parts excitement and uncertainty, emotions that she recognized as the hallmarks of approaching change. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of gray November sky that makes indoor lighting seem insufficient and outdoor activities uninviting. Charles woke before his alarm, which was unusual enough to make him lie still for several minutes, wondering what had shifted in his sleep patterns. His room felt different somehow, as if the previous day's small experiments in change had altered the familiar space in ways too subtle to identify immediately. The routine of getting ready proceeded as usual: shower, coffee, review of class notes. But Charles found himself making different choices within the established framework. He selected a blue shirt instead of his usual white one, chose the messenger bag instead of the backpack, and decided to walk a different route to campus. Each decision felt simultaneously insignificant and meaningful, like practicing for larger changes he couldn't yet imagine. The campus looked different from his alternate route, revealing angles of familiar buildings he had never noticed before. Charles passed a small garden tucked between academic buildings where students sometimes sat on benches to study. A sculpture he had walked past hundreds of times without really seeing now caught his attention, an abstract bronze piece that suggested both reaching and letting go, depending on the viewing angle. His first class was American Literature, a seminar that met in a classroom overlooking the main quad. Professor Chun was discussing Whitman's concept of transformation through experience, and Charles found himself more engaged than usual in the discussion. When she asked for examples of literature that explored sudden versus gradual change, Charles raised his hand for the first time in weeks. Dickinson's poetry often captures moments of revelation that feel sudden but have been building through careful observation, he offered, surprised by his own willingness to speak up. Professor Chin smiled approvingly. "Excellent point, Charles. Can you give us a specific example? Charles quoted from memory, I heard a fly buzz when I died. The moment of death as revelation, but the awareness has been present throughout the poem. The transformation is both instant and inevitable. The discussion that followed was lively, with several students building on Charles's observation. He contributed twice more, feeling increasingly comfortable with the give and take of academic conversation. Usually, he preferred to formulate complete thoughts before speaking, but today he found himself thinking aloud, letting ideas develop through dialogue. After class, a student named Maria approached him as they walked out. I really appreciated your insights about Dickinson. Are you working on anything related to transformation in literature? Charles found himself explaining his essay assignment about the build-up to transformative moments, describing his research into what makes certain experiences ready for change. Maria listened with genuine interest, sharing her own thoughts about how literature reflects the psychology of transformation. You should check out some contemporary neuroscience research on this, she suggested. There's fascinating work on how the brain processes moments of insight and change. I have some articles if you're interested. Charles accepted her offer to share the research, feeling pleased by the unexpected academic connection. As they exchanged contact information, he realized this was the kind of spontaneous collaboration he had always admired in other students, but rarely pursued himself. The walk to the coffee shop felt different today, charged with anticipation that Charles couldn't quite explain. He was curious about Kate's promised new coffee recommendation, but, more than that, he was interested in continuing their conversation about transformation and routine disruption. Her questions had stayed with him, adding new dimensions to his thinking about change. The morning rush was in full swing when Charles arrived. He waited in line, watching Kate work with the same observational intensity he brought to literary analysis. She moved with efficient grace, seeming to anticipate customers' needs before they articulated them. When she glanced up and saw him in line, her smile seemed particularly warm, though Charles wondered if he was reading more into her expression than was actually there. Ready for today's experiment? Kate asked when he reached the counter. Definitely. What do you recommend? Kate's eyes sparkled with something that looked like mischief. Pour to do. It's espresso with warm milk, but the ratio is different from a cappuccino. More coffee forward, but still smooth. I think you'll appreciate the precision involved in making it correctly. Charles liked that she had considered his personality in making the recommendation. That sounds perfect. And thank you for thinking about what might appeal to me specifically. I pay attention, Kate said simply, beginning to prepare his drink. How did yesterday's writing go after our conversation? Better than expected. Your point about disruption creating openings for change helped me understand something about the literature I'm analyzing. Charles found himself elaborating more than usual. Characters in Victorian novels often experience transformation when their social routines are interrupted by external events. And now you're interrupting your own routines to understand the process from the inside, Kate observed, demonstrating the milk technique for the courtier. That's really thoughtful research methodology. I hadn't thought of it as methodology exactly, but you're right. Charles watched her work, noting the careful attention she paid to temperature and texture. Do you always put this much consideration into drink recommendations? Kate paused in her work, seeming to consider whether to answer honestly. Not usually, but I find your project interesting, and I enjoy conversations about why people change. She handed him the courtier, and again their fingers touched briefly during the exchange. This time, Charles was certain the contact was intentional on both sides, though neither acknowledged it directly. Thank you for the coffee and for helping me think through these ideas. Charles took a sip, appreciating the balanced flavor Kate had described. This is excellent. I'm glad you like it. Same table by the window. Charles realized Kate had noticed his seating choice from the previous evening. Actually, I think I'll try somewhere different today. Part of the experiment. He chose a table in the center of the coffee shop, a location that would normally make him feel too visible and exposed. Today, however, he found the position interesting for observational purposes. He could see the entire space, watch the flow of foot traffic, and observe social interactions from multiple angles. Charles pulled out his notebook and began writing, but found himself frequently distracted by the activity around him. At the table to his left, two students were conducting what appeared to be a job interview or informational meeting. The interviewer's body language suggested skepticism, but as the conversation progressed, Charles watched both participants relax into more animated discussion. To his right, a study group was working through calculus problems, their collaboration marked by frustration, breakthrough moments, and mutual encouragement. Charles found himself invested in their progress, feeling pleased when they successfully solved particularly challenging equations. The realization that he was genuinely interested in these strangers' activities surprised him. Usually, public spaces made him want to retreat into his own thoughts and projects. Today, the social energy felt stimulating rather than overwhelming. Kate appeared at his table during a lull in customer traffic, carrying a cup of coffee for herself. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes? I'm taking my break." "Please." Charles gestured to the empty chair, feeling pleased by her initiative. "How's the core to do? And more importantly, how's the new table working out?" "Both excellent. I'm noticing things about this place I never paid attention to before." Charles gestured toward the study group. "Like how collaborative learning actually works in practice. It's more dynamic than I expected." Kate followed his gaze. "Those are regulars. They've been meeting here twice a week for the entire semester. In September, they barely talked except to argue about formulas. Now they're actually friends. You've been watching their transformation all semester? I notice patterns. It's partly the job, understanding customer behavior, but mostly I'm just interested in how people change over time." Kate sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Your essay assignment got me thinking about my own observations." Charles felt intrigued by the possibility that Kate conducted her own informal research into human behavior. "What patterns have you noticed?" "People seem to change more easily in neutral spaces like this. Away from their dorms or usual social groups, they can try out different versions of themselves." Kate paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. "Like you ordering different coffee and sitting in a new spot. Small changes, but they create openings for bigger shifts." "Is that what you think is happening to me? Bigger shifts?" Kate met his eyes directly. "I think you're someone who's been ready for change, but needed permission to experiment. Your essay assignment gave you an intellectual framework for trying new things." Charles found her analysis both perceptive and slightly unsettling. "What makes you think I was ready for change?" "The way you've been coming here for months, ordering the exact same thing, sitting in the exact same spot. That level of routine usually means someone is either completely satisfied with their life or feeling stuck, but afraid to admit it." The observation hit closer to home than Charles was comfortable acknowledging immediately. He had been feeling a growing sense of restlessness lately, a vague dissatisfaction with the predictability of his days. Kate had articulated something he hadn't been able to name himself. "And which do you think I was?" he asked. "Based on today's conversation, I think you were ready for something different, but needed a reason to try." Kate smiled. Good thing Professor Morrison assigned that essay. Their conversation was interrupted by a customer at the counter, and Kate returned to work. Charles continued writing, but his focus had shifted from his original essay topic to questions about his own readiness for change. Kate's observations about his routine patterns made him wonder what else he might be unconsciously preparing to transform. When lunchtime arrived, Charles realized he had been at the coffee shop for 3 hours, far longer than his usual 20-minute visit. The extended stay felt natural rather than forced, another small deviation from normal patterns that suggested something was shifting in his relationship to time and space. His afternoon class was contemporary poetry, a seminar that encouraged creative response to assigned readings. Professor Williams often asked students to write brief poems inspired by the work they were studying. Charles usually found these exercises challenging because he preferred analytical writing to creative expression. Today, however, when Professor Williams asked them to write a poem responding to Mary Oliver's work on attention and awareness, Charles found himself writing with unusual fluency. Between the familiar corner and the untried path, between the expected order and the welcome surprise, something waits, patient as morning coffee, unexpected as a stranger's insight. He was surprised by his own words, which seemed to capture something about his recent experiences that he hadn't been able to express in prose. When Professor Williams asked for volunteers to share their work, Charles raised his hand for the second time that day. After reading his poem aloud, Charles received positive feedback from both the professor and his classmates. The experience of sharing creative work felt different from academic discussion, more vulnerable, but also more personally satisfying. Walking back across campus after class, Charles found himself thinking about Kate's observation regarding neutral spaces and their potential for personal transformation. The coffee shop had become something different for him over the past 2 days, not just a place to get caffeine and work on assignments, but a space for social connection and self-discovery. He wondered if Kate was experiencing similar shifts in her own routine patterns. Their conversations had seemed meaningful to both of them, but Charles realized he knew relatively little about her life outside the coffee shop. She was a psychology major with interests in human behavior. She worked part-time while attending classes, and she possessed unusual observational skills. Beyond these basic facts, her life remained largely mysterious to him. The thought of learning more about Kate's experiences and perspectives felt appealing in a way that surprised Charles. He had always been someone who formed friendships slowly and carefully, preferring deep conversations with a few people to casual interactions with many. But something about Kate's intelligence and insight made him want to accelerate the usual timeline of social connection. Back in his dorm room, Charles attempted to work on his Victorian literature essay, but found his attention drifting repeatedly to questions about contemporary transformation rather than 19th century fiction. He wondered if his professor would accept a revised approach that incorporated personal experimentation with the theoretical analysis she had requested. David returned from his own classes around 5 o'clock, full of stories about a chemistry lab that had gone spectacularly wrong and a professor who had canceled class to attend a conference. Charles listened with more interest than usual, asking follow-up questions about David's experiences and sharing his own observations about the day's events. "You seem different today," David observed as they prepared to head to dinner. "More engaged or something? Did something happen?" Charles considered how to explain his recent experiments with routine disruption without sounding overly dramatic. "I've been thinking about change lately. How it happens, what triggers it. I decided to try some small experiments." "Like what?" "Different coffee orders, new seating arrangements, speaking up in class discussions." Charles laughed at how minor these changes sounded when listed aloud. "It sounds ridiculous when I say it. Actually, it sounds smart. You've been pretty locked into your patterns lately. Not that there's anything wrong with routine, but maybe some variety would be good." David pulled on his jacket. "Want to try a different restaurant tonight?" In the spirit of experimentation, Charles agreed, pleased that David was supporting rather than questioning his interest in change. They walked to a Thai restaurant neither had tried before, ordered dishes they couldn't pronounce with confidence, and talked about their respective approaches to college life and future planning. Over dinner, Charles found himself describing his conversations with Kate, though he tried to focus on the intellectual content rather than his growing personal interest in her perspectives. David listened with the kind of attention that good friends provide, asking questions that helped Charles clarify his own thoughts about transformation and social connection. "She sounds interesting," David said eventually. "When are you going to ask her to do something outside the coffee shop?" The suggestion made Charles realize he had been unconsciously hoping their interactions would expand beyond their current context, but he hadn't considered taking the initiative to make that happen. The idea of asking Kate to spend time together in a different setting felt both appealing and anxiety-provoking. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," Charles admitted. "Well, maybe that's your next experiment in change. Moving beyond the comfortable routine of coffee shop conversations." As they walked back to campus after dinner, Charles considered David's suggestion seriously. His experiments with disrupting routine had been successful so far, generating new insights and experiences he valued. Perhaps it was time to take a larger step outside his comfort zone, to risk the kind of social initiative that had always felt difficult for him. The possibility filled him with nervous excitement, the particular combination of anticipation and uncertainty that he was beginning to recognize as a sign of impending growth. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to extend his connection with Kate beyond their established pattern of brief coffee shop encounters. It was a decision that felt both small and momentous, another step in what was beginning to feel like a fundamental transformation of his approach to life and relationships. Charles fell asleep that night thinking about courage and change, about the difference between theoretical understanding and practical application, and about the possibility that his carefully ordered existence was ready for the kind of disruption that creates new possibilities. Friday arrived with unexpected sunshine that transformed the campus from its previous day's gray mood into something bright and promising. Charles woke with a sense of purpose that was both familiar and entirely new. Familiar because he had always approached his days with intention, new because today's intention involved social risk rather than academic achievement. He had decided to ask Kate if she would like to spend time together outside the coffee shop, though the specifics of this invitation remained unclear in his mind. As he prepared for the day, Charles found himself paying unusual attention to his appearance. Not vanity exactly, but a heightened awareness of how he might be perceived by someone whose opinion had begun to matter to him. He chose clothes that felt like himself, but perhaps a more confident version: dark jeans, a sweater that fit well, shoes that were practical but not purely functional. His morning class was Philosophy of Mind, a seminar that explored questions about consciousness, identity, and personal change over time. Professor Reynolds was discussing the problem of continuity in personal identity, whether people remained fundamentally the same despite experiencing transformation, or whether change constituted a kind of becoming someone new. Consider this question, Professor Reynolds posed to the class. If you make a decision that fundamentally alters your life direction, are you the same person who makes that choice as the one who lives with its consequences? Charles found the question particularly relevant to his current situation. His recent experiments with routine disruption felt like preparation for larger changes, but he couldn't predict what those changes might entail or who he might become through the process. The philosophical puzzle felt personally urgent rather than merely academic. During the discussion that followed, Charles contributed several times, building on other students' insights and offering his own perspective on the relationship between choice and identity. He noticed that speaking up in class was becoming easier with practice, another small transformation that suggested larger possibilities for social growth. After class, Maria approached him again, this time with a folder of neuroscience articles she had promised to share. I thought you might find these interesting for your literature essay. There's particularly good research on how the brain processes moments of insight and behavioral change. Charles accepted the articles gratefully, pleased by Maria's follow-through and her continued interest in his work. As they walked together toward the student union, she mentioned a study group that met weekly to discuss interdisciplinary approaches to research on human behavior. You should consider joining us. We could use someone with your background in literature and careful thinking about language and meaning. Maria pulled out her phone to show him the group's meeting schedule. Next Tuesday, we're discussing narrative psychology, how people construct stories about their own experiences of change. The invitation appealed to Charles on multiple levels. The academic content aligned with his current interests, the interdisciplinary approach would expand his perspective, and the social element represented another opportunity to practice collaborative learning. He agreed to attend the next meeting, exchanging contact information with Maria so she could send him background readings. Walking alone toward the coffee shop after their conversation, Charles reflected on how quickly his social world was expanding. 2 weeks ago, he had been someone who attended classes, completed assignments, and maintained a few close friendships within carefully defined boundaries. Now he was contributing to class discussions, forming new academic relationships, and preparing to take initiative in asking Kate to spend time together outside their established routine. The changes felt organic rather than forced, as if he had been unconsciously ready for expansion and needed only permission to begin exploring new possibilities. Kate's observations about disruption creating openings for transformation seemed increasingly accurate based on his own experience. The coffee shop was less crowded than usual when Charles arrived, with many students apparently taking advantage of the unexpected sunshine to study outdoors or skip morning classes altogether. Kate was behind the counter organizing inventory, her movements efficient and graceful as she worked through what appeared to be a detailed checklist. She looked up as he approached, her smile immediate and warm. Good morning. Ready for another coffee experiment? Actually, I was hoping to try the Cortado again. I keep thinking about it. Charles found it easier than expected to admit his preference for repeating rather than advancing his caffeinated adventures. Excellent choice. I'm glad it made an impression. Kate began preparing his drink with the same careful attention she had shown the previous day. How did your writing go yesterday? Did the change in seating help with your observations? More than I expected. I ended up staying for 3 hours, watching social dynamics, and thinking about transformation in ways that felt more immediate than theoretical. Charles accepted his Cortado, noticing that Kate had created intricate leaf pattern in the milk foam. This is beautiful, by the way. Thank you. I like making drinks that are as visually appealing as they taste. Kate paused, seeming to consider something before continuing. Speaking of observations and social dynamics, I was wondering if you'd be interested in continuing our conversation about transformation sometime when I'm not working. Maybe we could explore some of your insights about change outside the coffee shop context. Charles felt simultaneously relieved and surprised that Kate had taken the initiative he had been gathering courage to take himself. I would really like that. What did you have in mind? There's a small art gallery downtown that's showing work by local photographers. The exhibition is about urban spaces and how they shape human behavior. I thought it might provide interesting material for thinking about environment and transformation. Kate's suggestion demonstrated the same thoughtful consideration she had shown in her coffee recommendations. That sounds perfect. When would work for you? I'm free tomorrow afternoon if that suits your schedule. We could meet around 2 o'clock. Charles confirmed his availability, feeling pleased by the prospect of experiencing Kate's perspective on visual art and social observation. They arranged to meet at the gallery entrance, exchanging phone numbers so they could coordinate if needed. I'm looking forward to it, Kate said as Charles prepared to leave. And Charles, thank you for being willing to experiment with change. Our conversations have been helping me think about my own patterns too. Her admission that their interactions had been mutually meaningful filled Charles with quiet satisfaction. He had been wondering whether his interest in expanding their connection was one-sided, and Kate's acknowledgement suggested that she too was curious about what might develop between them. Charles found a table by the window, his new usual spot, and opened his notebook, intending to work on his Victorian literature essay. Instead, he found himself writing about the experience of conscious change, the way small decisions could accumulate into larger transformations, and the role of other people in catalyzing personal growth. His writing flowed easily as he explored connections between literary examples of transformation and his own recent experiences. Jane Eyre's decision to leave Rochester, Elizabeth Bennet's shifting perception of Darcy, Pip's gradual understanding of true gentility, all seem to involve characters becoming ready for change through relationships that challenge their established patterns of thought and behavior. Charles realized that his essay was evolving beyond the original assignment into something more personal and contemporary. He wondered if Professor Morrison would appreciate this expansion or prefer a more traditional analysis. The uncertainty bothered him less than it might have a week ago. His recent experiments with academic risk-taking had increased his tolerance for unpredictable outcomes. Around noon, Charles decided to take a break from writing and walk around campus, partly for physical exercise but mainly to continue his observations of social behavior in different environments. The sunshine had indeed brought more people outdoors, and the quad was filled with students reading, playing frisbee, and conducting impromptu study sessions on blankets spread across the grass. Charles sat on a bench near the main walkway and pulled out his notebook, sketching observations about how environmental factors influence social interaction. Sunny weather seemed to make people more open to casual conversation with strangers, more likely to engage in physical activities that required cooperation, and more willing to linger in public spaces rather than hurrying toward indoor destinations. A group of students nearby was discussing plans for winter break, their conversation touching on family obligations, financial constraints, and desires for adventure that exceeded their practical resources. Charles found himself thinking about his own holiday plans, which suddenly seemed limited compared to the possibilities these students were considering. For the first time in years, Charles wondered if he should consider alternative ways to spend winter break. Perhaps visiting friends in different cities, taking a short trip somewhere he had never been, or even remaining on campus to work on independent projects without the structure of family expectations. The idea of deviation from established holiday routines felt both exciting and anxiety-provoking. His phone buzzed with a text from David, asking if he wanted to grab lunch together. Charles agreed, gathering his materials and walking toward their planned meeting spot near the dining hall. He found David waiting with 2 other students from their dormitory floor, both of whom Charles knew casually but had never spent extended time with socially. "Hope you don't mind if Jake and Sam join us," David said as Charles approached. "We were all complaining about cafeteria food and decided to venture off campus for better options." Charles did mind slightly. He had been looking forward to discussing his upcoming gallery visit with David, but he recognized the lunch expansion as another opportunity to practice social flexibility. The 4 of them walked to a sandwich shop near campus, falling into conversation about weekend plans and recent campus events. Jake was a music major who played guitar in a band that performed at local venues. Sam studied computer science and worked part-time for the university's IT department. Both were more outgoing than Charles usually felt comfortable with, but their energy was inclusive rather than overwhelming. They asked questions about his literature studies and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. During lunch, the conversation turned to winter break plans. Jake described a band tour through several small cities in neighboring states. Sam mentioned an internship opportunity that would require him to remain near campus but would provide valuable professional experience. David talked about his complicated family visit schedule, which involved multiple cities and careful diplomatic navigation of divorced parents. When they asked about Charles's plans, he found himself describing not his established routine, but his recent thoughts about alternative possibilities. "I'm considering some changes from my usual pattern. Maybe staying on campus for part of the break to work on independent projects, or taking a short trip somewhere I haven't been before. That sounds cool, Sam said approvingly. I think winter break is a good time to try new things. Less pressure than during the semester. Jake suggested that Charles consider visiting cities where local music scenes might provide cultural experiences different from his usual academic focus. David offered to share information about cheap travel options and budget accommodation strategies he had discovered through his own adventures. Charles felt grateful for their enthusiasm and practical suggestions, even though he hadn't yet committed to abandoning his traditional holiday plans. The conversation reinforced his growing sense that change was possible at multiple levels simultaneously. Daily routines, social connections, and longer-term life directions could all be adjusted incrementally or dramatically depending on his willingness to experiment. After lunch, Charles returned to his dorm room to work on assignments and prepare for his evening shift at the campus library. He had been working there for 2 years, helping with book reshelving and providing research assistance to undergraduate students. The job was quiet and suited his temperament, though it offered limited opportunities for the kind of social interaction he was beginning to value more highly. Tonight, however, Charles found himself approaching his library work with renewed attention to its social dimensions. Students who requested help with research often seemed stressed about upcoming assignments or confused about how to navigate academic resources effectively. Charles realized he could provide not just technical assistance, but also emotional support through patient explanation and encouragement. His first interaction of the evening was with a freshman who was overwhelmed by the prospect of writing her first college research paper. She needed sources about environmental policy, but felt intimidated by the library's databases and academic search functions. Charles spent 20 minutes walking her through different search strategies, helping her identify key terms, and explaining how to evaluate source credibility. "Thank you so much," she said as she gathered her materials. "You made this so much less scary. I was beginning to think I would never figure out how to research properly." Her gratitude felt meaningful to Charles in a way that surprised him. He had always enjoyed helping other students, but tonight he recognized that these interactions represented opportunities for genuine human connection rather than just job responsibilities. The realization suggested another area of his life where small changes in attention and intention could create more satisfying experiences. Throughout the evening, Charles approached each student interaction with increased presence and care. He helped a graduate student locate obscure historical documents, assisted a junior with citation formatting, and provided research guidance to a sophomore working on a complex sociology project. Each conversation felt more engaging than usual because Charles was actively seeking ways to be helpful beyond the minimum requirements of his position. As his shift ended, and Charles prepared to lock up his section of the library, he reflected on the day's accumulation of small social successes. From contributing meaningfully to class discussion to accepting Maria's study group invitation to planning a gallery visit with Kate to engaging more fully with his library work, he had practiced different aspects of social connection and community participation. The pattern suggested that his transformation was not limited to romantic interest in Kate, though their developing relationship certainly provided motivation for personal growth. Instead, he seemed to be discovering a more general capacity for human connection that had been present but underutilized in his previous approach to college life. Walking back to his dormitory under stars that were visible despite campus lighting, Charles felt anticipation for tomorrow's gallery visit mixed with broader excitement about the direction his life seemed to be taking. Change, he was learning, was not just about disrupting established routines, but about developing new capacities for engagement with the world and other people. He fell asleep thinking about art and conversation, about the difference between observing social dynamics and participating in them, and about the possibility that transformation might be less about becoming someone different than about becoming more fully himself. Saturday afternoon brought the kind of crisp November air that made Charles grateful for his decision to wear layers. He arrived at the downtown gallery 15 minutes early, partly due to his habitual punctuality, and partly because nervous energy had made staying in his room impossible. The gallery occupied a renovated warehouse space, its industrial architecture softened by large windows, and carefully designed lighting that created an atmosphere of casual sophistication. Charles stood outside for several minutes, watching people enter and exit the building. The afternoon crowd was diverse: college students, local professionals, families with children, elderly couples walking slowly and discussing what they had seen. He found himself wondering about Kate's relationship to art galleries, whether this was a regular activity for her or a special suggestion chosen specifically for their first extended conversation. Kate appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, wearing a long coat that made her look both artistic and practical. She smiled when she saw Charles waiting, and he felt the same small electric awareness that had marked their previous interactions. "Perfect timing," she said as they approached the entrance together. "I'm curious to see what you think of this exhibition. The photographer is local, but the work has gotten attention from some major art magazines." The gallery's interior was more spacious than it had appeared from outside, with white walls and polished concrete floors that provided neutral backgrounds for the displayed photographs. Charles and Kate paid their admission and accepted a printed guide that included an artist's statement and map of the exhibition layout. The first section featured large-scale photographs of urban environments at different times of day. Empty streets at dawn, crowded sidewalks during lunch hour, parks filled with evening joggers, late-night scenes outside restaurants and bars. Each image captured not just the physical space, but the human energy that animated it. "Look at this one," Kate said, stopping in front of a photograph showing a bus stop at rush hour. "See how everyone is maintaining careful personal space despite being packed together? And the body language, everyone avoiding eye contact but still aware of each other." Charles studied the image with increased attention, noticing details that Kate's comment had highlighted. "It's like a choreographed dance where nobody acknowledges they're dancing. Everyone following unspoken rules about urban proximity." "Exactly. And notice how the photographer positioned himself to capture that dynamic without disrupting it. He's documenting natural behavior by remaining invisible himself." They moved slowly through the exhibition, discussing each photograph's treatment of space, light, and human interaction. Charles found Kate's observations consistently insightful, revealing aspects of the images he might have missed on his own. Her perspective combined artistic appreciation with psychological understanding, creating a viewing experience that felt both educational and deeply engaging. In the second section, the photographs focused on transitional spaces, train stations, airport waiting areas, hospital corridors, university campuses during semester breaks. These images captured environments where people were temporarily suspended between one part of their lives and another. "These remind me of our conversations about transformative moments," Charles said as they stood before a photograph of an empty dormitory hallway. "Spaces where change happens, but nothing dramatic is visible on the surface." Kate nodded thoughtfully. "The photographer is documenting the physical settings where internal transformation occurs, like how a coffee shop can become a place where someone decides to try new things or take social risks." Charles felt pleased by her reference to his own recent experiences, recognizing it as acknowledgement of the personal significance their conversations had held for both of them. He was beginning to understand that Kate's invitation to visit the gallery together was not just about shared intellectual interests, but about continuing the process of getting to know each other outside their established routine. The third section presented photographs taken during various weather conditions. Rain transforming familiar streets into reflective surfaces, snow creating temporary sculptures on everyday objects, fog making well-known landmarks mysterious and unfamiliar. The images explored how environmental changes altered both the appearance and the social use of urban spaces. "Weather as a disruptor of routine," Kate observed. "People relate to the same physical environment differently depending on atmospheric conditions. Like how yesterday's sunshine brought more people outdoors and seemed to make everyone more social," Charles added. "I spent time observing campus interactions and noticed that good weather created opportunities for spontaneous conversation that wouldn't have happened indoors." "You're really taking this research seriously," Kate said with a smile that suggested approval rather than teasing. "Have you noticed changes in your own behavior patterns as a result of conscious observation?" Charles considered how to answer honestly without sounding overly analytical about their developing relationship. "I think paying attention to transformation in literature made me more aware of possibilities for change in my own life. Small experiments that have led to larger shifts in how I approach social situations, such as asking someone to visit art galleries on Saturday afternoons, such as accepting invitations from people whose perspectives I want to understand better," Charles replied, pleased with his ability to respond to Kate's gentle directness. They had reached the final section of the exhibition, which featured photographs of the same urban locations taken over the course of several years. The images documented gradual changes, buildings under construction, trees growing larger, businesses opening and closing, infrastructure improvements, and deterioration. Viewing them in sequence created a time-lapse effect that revealed the constant evolution of seemingly stable environments. This is what long-term transformation looks like, Kate said as they studied a series showing a neighborhood block through 4 seasons across 3 years. Incremental changes that add up to significant alteration, but each individual change is barely noticeable. Charles found the time series photographs particularly moving, reminding him of his recent philosophical discussions about personal identity and continuity through change. It makes me wonder whether people change the same way, gradually and constantly, but only noticeably when you compare distant points in time. Do you feel like you're in the middle of that kind of change now? The question was more direct than their previous exchanges, and Charles sensed that Kate was asking not just about his academic interest in transformation, but about his personal experience of the past week. He felt ready to be equally direct in response. Yes, I do. A week ago, I would never have imagined spending a Saturday afternoon at an art gallery discussing photographs with someone I had only spoken to briefly at a coffee shop. But it doesn't feel sudden or forced. It feels like I was ready for this kind of change, but needed some external catalyst, like an essay assignment about transformative moments, like conversations with someone who pays attention to human behavior and asks interesting questions about why people change, Charles corrected gently. They had finished viewing the exhibition and found themselves standing near the gallery in trance, neither quite ready to end their afternoon together. Charles felt the same anticipation he had experienced before asking Kate to spend time outside the coffee shop, but amplified by the success of their gallery visit and the increasing intimacy of their conversation. Would you like to get coffee somewhere? He asked. I realize that might seem redundant given that we met at a coffee shop, but I'd like to continue our conversation if you have time. I'd enjoy that. There's a place a few blocks from here that's completely different from the campus shop, more like someone's living room than a business. Kate pulled on her coat as they prepared to leave the gallery. It might be interesting to see how a different environment affects our usual coffee shop dynamic. They walked through downtown streets that Charles rarely visited, past local businesses and residential areas that revealed a version of the city he hadn't previously explored. Kate pointed out details about neighborhood architecture, local restaurants she had tried, and small businesses owned by university alumni who had decided to remain in the area after graduation. The coffee shop Kate had recommended was indeed unlike any place Charles had experienced. Mismatched furniture, books scattered on tables, local art covering the walls, and a general atmosphere of creative chaos that somehow felt welcoming rather than disorganized. They ordered drinks and found seats in a corner that felt both public and private. This is perfect, Charles said, settling into a worn velvet chair that was surprisingly comfortable. Thank you for suggesting it. I come here when I need to think or write. The environment encourages a different kind of concentration than more formal study spaces. Kate curled up in her own chair, holding her cup with both hands. What did you think of the gallery? Did the photographs change how you think about urban transformation? Charles had been formulating his response throughout their walk from the gallery. They made transformation seem more constant and less dramatic than I usually consider it. Instead of pivotal moments that change everything, the photographer documented the ongoing process of change that's always happening in the background of daily life. Both kinds of change are real, though, gradual evolution and sudden shifts. Maybe they work together. The gradual changes create conditions that make sudden transformation possible when the right catalyst appears. Like how my routine experiments this week created openness to the kind of social connection that would have felt too risky before. Kate smiled at his application of their theoretical discussion to their personal situation. Exactly like that. You were changing gradually through your academic work and daily choices, which made you ready to respond differently when the opportunity for new social experience presented itself. Charles found himself studying Kate's face as she spoke, noticing details that their coffee shop interactions hadn't allowed him to observe. The way her eyes reflected light differently depending on her expression, how her gestures became more animated when discussing ideas that excited her, the particular quality of attention she brought to conversations about human behavior and personal growth. Can I ask you something? Charles said, feeling ready to shift their conversation toward more personal territory. How did you develop such insight into social dynamics? Your observations about routine and change have been more helpful than most of my academic reading on the subject. Kate considered the question while watching other customers in the coffee shop around them. I think it started with feeling like an outsider in social situations when I was younger. When you don't instinctively understand social rules, you become conscious of observing and analyzing them. What began as survival strategy became genuine intellectual interest. Her admission created a moment of connection that felt different from their previous exchanges, more vulnerable and intimate. Charles recognized something of his own experience in Kate's description of social observation as both necessity and curiosity. I can relate to that. I've always felt more comfortable analyzing social dynamics than participating in them spontaneously. Meeting you has been interesting because our conversations have felt both analytical and natural, like thinking and connecting at the same time. That's exactly how I experience our interactions too, Kate said. Usually I feel like I have to choose between being socially engaged or intellectually stimulated. With you, those things seem compatible. The acknowledgement of mutual compatibility created a moment of silence that felt significant rather than awkward. Charles found himself aware of the space between them, the particular quality of afternoon light in the coffee shop, the way their conversation had moved from academic discussion to personal recognition. Kate broke the silence first, but gently. This might be forward of me, but would you be interested in spending more time together outside our usual coffee shop routine? I'm curious about what other kinds of conversations and experiences we might discover. Charles felt relief and excitement at Kate's initiative, recognizing it as exactly the kind of direct communication that had characterized their interactions from the beginning. I would really like that. I've been hoping our connection would continue developing, but I wasn't sure how to suggest expanding it. Well, now we don't have to wonder. Kate's smile was warm and slightly mischievous. What kinds of things interest you outside academic work? I realize I know about your literature studies and research methods, but not much about how you spend non-academic time. Charles found himself describing interests he rarely discussed with casual acquaintances. His enjoyment of long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, his collection of old maps that revealed how cities had changed over time, his habit of visiting used bookstores to discover books by authors he had never heard of. Kate listened with the same engaged attention she brought to their discussions about transformation and social behavior. You're full of surprises, she said when he finished. I would never have guessed that someone so methodical in academic work would be drawn to random exploration and serendipitous discovery. Maybe that's why I needed permission to experiment with change in other areas of my life. I already had outlets for spontaneity, but I kept them separate from social situations. And now, Charles considered the question while observing their current situation. Sitting in an unfamiliar coffee shop, having moved beyond their established routine, discussing personal interests and mutual attraction with someone he had known for less than a week in any meaningful way. Now I'm beginning to think that separation was artificial, that the same curiosity that draws me to exploring unknown neighborhoods might apply to exploring new kinds of relationships and social experiences. Kate reached across the small table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. I'm looking forward to finding out what we discover. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but it created a shift in the atmosphere between them, an acknowledgement of romantic possibility that had been present but unspoken in their previous interactions. Charles felt simultaneously nervous and exhilarated by the development, recognizing it as exactly the kind of transformative moment he had been studying in literature and beginning to experience in his own life. They spent another hour at the coffee shop, talking about books, travel plans, family backgrounds, and future aspirations with the easy intimacy of people discovering compatible perspectives and shared curiosity about the world. When they finally gathered their belongings to leave, Charles felt that the afternoon had accomplished something significant beyond entertainment or intellectual stimulation. Walking back toward campus as evening approached, Charles realized that his week-long experiment with conscious change had led to outcomes he could never have predicted when he first decided to order a cappuccino instead of black coffee. Small disruptions of routine had created openings for social connection, intellectual growth, and personal transformation that felt both surprising and inevitable. Kate walked beside him, occasionally commenting on details of their surroundings that reflected her ongoing interest in urban observation and human behavior. Charles found himself thinking about Monday morning, about whether their developing relationship would change the dynamic of his regular coffee shop visits, about how to integrate this new aspect of his life with his established academic and social routines. But those questions felt less urgent than they might have a week ago. Charles was beginning to understand that successful navigation of change required tolerance for uncertainty, willingness to experiment with new approaches, and trust that his capacity for adaptation was greater than he had previously recognized. As they reached the edge of campus and prepared to separate toward their respective dormitories, Kate turned to face him directly. "Thank you for a wonderful afternoon. I'm glad we decided to continue our conversation outside the coffee shop. Thank you for the invitation and for showing me the gallery. This has been one of the most engaging afternoons I can remember." They stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, both seeming to recognize that their connection had shifted significantly during their time together. Charles felt an impulse to kiss Kate goodbye, but also uncertainty about whether such a gesture would be welcome or premature. Kate seemed to sense his hesitation and made the choice for both of them, leaning forward to kiss his cheek in a way that was affectionate without being overwhelming. "I'll see you Monday morning for coffee," she said with a smile that suggested their routine had been permanently altered by the afternoon's experiences. Charles walked back to his dormitory with a sense of completion and anticipation that felt entirely new in his experience. He had successfully navigated social risk-taking, expanded his understanding of art and urban observation, and begun what felt like a meaningful romantic relationship with someone whose intelligence and insight he deeply respected. More than these specific accomplishments, however, Charles felt that he had discovered something important about his own capacity for growth and change. The past week had taught him that transformation was not something that happened to him accidentally, but something he could participate in consciously through attention, intention, and willingness to move beyond established patterns of thought and behavior. Back in his room, Charles sat at his desk and opened his notebook, intending to record observations about the day's experiences. Instead, he found himself writing about possibility, about the difference between imagining change and experiencing it, about the role of other people in catalysis.